we do a beautiful job at celebrating diversity in the city with our parades and flag raisings and lapel pins. But ultimately, the best way to really respect that diversity is not simply to celebrate it, it's to honor it. And that is about shared power. And that shared power is about making sure that you have that cognitive diversity, and diversity of perspective, opinion, and thought in the corridors of power and around decision-making tables. People often ask me before my election, I was so glad y'all didn't clap on Pam saying I was the first woman elected, a woman of color elected to the council in 2010. Because what a very sad commentary that is, that it took over 100 years. And so people will often ask me, well, who suffered when there wasn't a woman of color on the Boston City Council? Women, African American? My response is always the same, everyone. Yeah, Bob, you got it. Everyone, right? Because when you have that diversity of perspective, opinion, and thought around the table, it means the issues that are being raised are more robust and fully informed. And it means the solutions that are developed are more robust and fully informed and more innovative, right? So when I joined the council, I formed a standing policy committee. It's the Committee on Healthy Women, Families, and Communities.
Now joining.
We work on big social determinant issues, poverty alleviation. I won't even say that. I'm trying to eradicate it, and I do think it's possible. Addressing violence in all forms and reducing trauma in our communities. And then also working with issues that disproportionately adversely impact women and girls. And I do have lawmaking and policy accolades that I can point to in all these spaces around human trafficking, teen pregnancy, domestic violence, sexual assault, fighting for more women in police and fire and the trades, and the growth of women-owned small businesses. I'll just highlight two quick policies, and I'm proudest of in sort of my 8 years on the council. So one is liquor license reform. You know, traveling the entire city of Boston, which I represent, which is about 670,000 people, and growing 18 distinct wards, 22 neighborhoods, I saw this contrast in our main streets. There were neighborhoods, their main streets had great vitality, and they were destination locations, and that was not true for every neighborhood. And so I looked at what was the common thread and connective tissue for those main streets that were thriving, and it was that they had walkable amenities in the form of sit-down restaurants. You know, I do believe in the transformative power of food and the food economy. I didn't just get these hips from my mama. And I do believe in the power of neighborhood restaurants as social and economic engines, and they build community, and they're the path of least resistance for those who experience barriers to employment. The largest employer of immigrants, those who have quarries. It's the path of least resistance for entrepreneurialism. You know, 2 out of 4 of our restaurants are owned by someone that started in the front of the house. 3 out of 5 are owned by a woman, a person of color, or an immigrant. And so because of an antiquated law, raise your hand if you're Irish in here. Okay, so I was fighting for you. There was this racist law 100 years ago. The state decided that the Irish should not decide where alcohol was purchased and distributed throughout the city of Boston. Can you imagine that? And so they put an arbitrary cap on liquor licenses. Now, listen, I've dedicated my life to eradicating social ills, so I'm not promoting drinking. But the reality is that no matter how good your restaurant is, your profit margin is made on your bar. And so because of this antiquated law and this arbitrary cap, it created a 2-tiered system where you have neighborhoods like the Back Bay and the North End and the South End that have a density and saturation of restaurants who didn't want anymore, who felt it was choking at their residential quality of life, but the neighborhoods like Roxbury, Mattapan, and Dorchester, who had not seen a new sit-down restaurant for 20 years. Why? Because a full alcohol license was going for $250,000 on the black market, and beer and wine was going for $35,000 to $55,000. And so I sojourned hard, and I was told by many to leave this issue alone, that it was third rail, that the system was working for a lot of people just the way that it was. But I decided to take this on, and I reformed the state's liquor license laws. And we were able to begin to reverse the tide of this 100-year-old law, and to address the issue of food deserts, and to bring sit-down restaurants and walkable amenities to both enrich quality of life in those neighborhoods, but to make those neighborhoods destination locations. And now those liquor licenses, of which I was able to onboard 75 new licenses, are going for $2,700 to $3,000. So we have eliminated this cost-prohibitive barrier, and 80% of those licenses are restricted to neighborhoods historically disenfranchised and marginalized, What does that mean? It means wealth building in perpetuity. Those licenses cannot leave these communities. And so, in fact, Roxbury in the last 3 years, because of this legislation, has now seen 7 new restaurants when it had not seen a new restaurant for 20 years. So this is Black History Month, and the state rep for Roxbury, China Tyler, has actually issued a Black Restaurant Challenge, challenging everyone to support the building of Black wealth and the food economy. And so I issue that challenge to you to patronize 4 restaurants before Black History Month ends.
And personally, I'm happy to see a number of new restaurants in Dorchester, so people should come out there.
17.
17. Great restaurants.
17. Please do support them. And I would just say, I think it is so important because Boston, in dealing still with the residual effects of desegregation and also redlining, the city is incredibly segregated. You know, having grown up in Chicago and then having worked on Capitol Hill off and on for many years of my life as an aide to Congressman Joseph P. Kennedy II and the United States Senator John Kerry, I can tell you in both of those cities, our socialization was very integrated, and that is not true here. And so what I love about restaurants, these are the spaces, some of the rare spaces that you will only see the diversity of the city fully represented. So I really do believe it's in the power of restaurants to build community and to foster fellowship, which is so critical to all the work and the things we care about, because you cannot do good business. You cannot get to a more inclusive economy. You cannot get to diversity and inclusion. You cannot address, an excellent urban, public education system. You can't do any of this work unless you are in good relationship. And because the city is so segregated and very tribal and very parochial, I do believe in the power of food. In fact, there was a study that came out that said some of our greatest change agents host regular dinner parties. So, have me over.
So it's interesting that you raised this topic of inclusion and diversity and sort of what we've seen here in Boston, because back in December, what was all the buzz? It was the Boston Globe Spotlight Series on race and racism in Boston. So I ask you, what did you think about all of these stories, and what are you doing to address some of the issues that were raised?
Well, none of it was surprising. It was sobering, but not surprising. I do think it was elucidating and enlightening to many, which I'm glad, and I was encouraged by people from every walk of life, both in spaces that I was in and on social media, that were upset about what they were reading. And that's what we need, is for everyone to have a stakehold in addressing these entrenched inequities and inequalities and disparities. You know, for so long as we continue to marginalize whose problem that is, we all suffer. And so I do appreciate that spotlight. And I think the challenge for us always is, how do we maintain a vigilance in our upset, that it isn't something that's short-lived and then everyone fades to black, no pun intended. There are 2 quotes in my life that guide me. One are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "Laws may not change hearts, but they restrain the reckless." And so every day as I'm reading the newspaper and in my comings and goings, I'm listening for who is behaving recklessly, so that I can think about the policy and the law to restrain them. The other is, I had the good fortune of being a fellow through the Aspen Institute, and I was a Rodell Fellow. And one of the thought leaders there was admiring my poverty alleviation work, specifically around teen pregnancy and some other things that I had done, and said, "Ayanna, never forget that situational solutions will never resolve systemic problems." So these are the 2 things that guide me as a thought leader. Laws may not change hearts, but they restrain the reckless. And situational solutions will never resolve systemic problems. So when I read the Globe Spotlight series, my lens is, okay, what are we going to do beyond culture and get to a place of policy, protocols, and practices? And again, laws are only as good as their enforcement, right? And so that gets to the human part, how are people enforcing those things? They're not the ceiling, but they give you the floor, and they give you the leverage. And so that's what I've been looking at. As someone who considers myself an activist, how do I institutionalize my activism through policy to address these things? As I mentioned earlier, redlining. That is a policy that we are still digging out from, that has affected black wealth, that has perpetuated the segregating of our neighborhoods, and so for decades we are living with that. So policy making matters, and that's what I'm focused on. And so one way that I was getting at that was through liquor license reform. Another way is former Council President Michelle Wu and I partnered to advance an ordinance around minority women business enterprises and the city increasing their spend, which is anemic. That was something that was highlighted in the Spotlight series, that there wasn't an equity and opportunity to bid for services for the city of Boston. And so we hope that this ordinance will give us the leverage so that we will see an increase in procurement and contracting opportunities for MWBEs.
I'm going to switch to a different topic because we do have members here from our Women's Leadership Group, which is another of our ERGs. So my question to you is, what is your opinion about the Me Too campaign? You spoke a little bit earlier about sort of sexual abuse coming up. And then secondly, how does it impact your current work?
So, I've never been one to shy away from tough issues, and I'm very proud that in my 8 years on the council I've been able to tackle some very complex social issues through lawmaking. I will tell you, for all of the issues that I've pushed for, sex ed and condoms in our schools, and an expected and parenting teen policy to prevent dropout, and liquor license reform, and equity in the cannabis industry, both in ownership and workforce, all these things, human trafficking, all these things that make people uncomfortable. The first time I ever received hate mail was when I disclosed that I was a survivor of campus sexual assault. I know personally the cultural, we are culturally predisposed to victim blame. I received letters calling me a liar, a whore, someone trying to evoke sympathy. And so I hope my sharing that illustrates just how tough these issues are. And the reason why I think they are is, one, it is challenging for anyone to wrap their minds around that someone that they love could be violated in such an egregious way, and violent way, and vile way. But what's even harder is to think about the capacity of someone they love to violate someone in such a vile, violent, and egregious way. And so it speaks to the underbelly of sort of the human condition and what our capacity is, right? To do dark things. And that makes people very uncomfortable. I am grateful for the elevated consciousness around the issue. Certainly is not a new issue, and it is a crime that does not discriminate. It doesn't care about your socioeconomic status, your gender orientation, your sexual identity, your race. It doesn't care about any of that. And so when I disclosed that I was a survivor, as painful as the immediate backlash was, I have to tell you, to this day, there is not a week and sometimes a room that I go into that someone does not pull me to the side and say, thank you for sharing your story. It's my story too. It is my brother's story. It is my mother's story. So I am encouraged by the elevated consciousness around this issue. Again, it doesn't discriminate, but it does disproportionately affect women. And I'm glad that we are arriving at a zero-tolerant culture where it will no longer be synonymous with being a woman to be a victim of sexual harassment, exploitation, or assault. but again, back to policy. So that's what I'm focused on, is because when I talk to community-based organizations,